Chapter 14. City on the Neva. And have such changes been taking place in St. Petersburg, too, as well as in Moscow? I asked Anastasía. Events happened somewhat differently in the city on the Neva, she replied. There it was the children who, even before the adults, felt the need of doing something themselves about creating a different kind of future. The children took it upon themselves to start changing the city without waiting for a decree from the authorities. Wow, children again? How did it all start? At the corner where Nevsky Prospect crosses the Fontanka embankment, some workers had dug a trench. An 11-year-old boy who accidentally fell into it and injured his leg. While he was recuperating, he spent a long time sitting at the window of his flat at number 25 Fontanka embankment. But his apartment windows looked out not onto the river, but onto an interior courtyard. The view included a shabby brick wall and the rusty spots covering the roof of the house it was attached to. One day the boy asked his father, "Papa, isn't our city supposed to be the best in the country?" "Of course," the father replied. "It is one of the best in the world." "And why is it the best?" "What do you mean, why? It's got a lot of different kinds of monuments and museums, and the architecture in the city center is world famous." "But we live in the city center too, and all we can see from our windows is a shabby wall and the rusty roof of the building next door." "A wall? Well, yes, we didn't do so well with the view." "Are we the only ones?" "Maybe a few others, but anyway." The boy took a snapshot of the view from his apartment window, and when he was able to go to school again, he showed the photo to his chums. Then all the children in his class took snapshots from their windows and compared the photos. The overall picture was not very pretty. The boy and his chums went to see the editors of one of the local papers and asked the same question he had earlier asked his father. Why is our city supposed to be more beautiful than others? They tried explaining to him about Alexander's Column and the Hermitage. They talked about the Kazan Cathedral and the legendary Nevsky Prospect. "What makes the Nevsky so hot?" the boy inquired. "I think it looks like a stone trench with flaking edges." They tried explaining to him about the architectural merits of the thoroughfare, about the sculptural moldings on the building's facades, about how the city at the moment didn't have enough funds to restore all the houses at once, but soon there would be money available, and then everybody would see how beautiful Nevsky really was. "But what's so beautiful about a stone trench, even if the facades are spruced up? Besides, it'll only get shabby again before long, and they'll only have to refill the holes and fix up the parts that have fallen down." The boy and his chums went around to various editorial offices, showing them their now considerable collection of photos and asking the same question over and over again. At first, the journalists were irritated at his persistence. On one occasion, a reporter with a youth newspaper told him, "Oh, it's you again. And now you're dragging your henchmen along with you? You've got more and more of them, it seems, all the time. You may not like the city, the view from the windows, but can't you do at least something about it yourselves? There's enough criticizing going on without you kids adding your 2 cents worth. Go back to your homes and stop interfering with our work." The admonition was overheard by a veteran journalist, who, after seeing the group of children make their way out of the newspaper offices, spoke thoughtfully to the young reporter. "You know, their audacity reminds me of a particular fairy tale." "A fairy tale? Which one?" the reporter inquired. "The emperor has no clothes. Remember those words in the story?" After that, the boys stopped bothering the editors with questions and showing the huge collection of pictures they carried around in a backpack. The school year ended, and come September another began. And it didn't take long for the news to spread through the newspaper offices. The boy and his chums are back again. The veteran journalist exclaimed to his colleagues at the journalist club, and for the umpteenth time, "He's back. Yes, indeed. And just think, he finally managed to get a hearing. And he wasn't alone. They all sat quietly waiting together in the reception room for about 3 hours. I agreed to see them. I warned them to talk quickly, as I had set aside only 2 minutes to hear what they had to say. They came in and spread out a huge sheet of drafting paper across my desk. I looked at their masterpiece and was dumbfounded. I kept looking, not being able to take my eyes away, or even to say a word. 2 minutes must have gone by, before I heard one of the boys say to everyone, "It's time for us to leave. We've outstayed our welcome." "What's that?" I called after them, just as they were on their way out the door. He turned around, and I felt the look of another age descend upon me. Yes, indeed, there's a lot we still have to think through, make sense of. Yes, indeed. "Well, did he say anything?" asked a colleague. Others, too, became restless and asked, "Don't keep us in suspense. Did he say he was coming back?" Whereupon the veteran editor replied. He turned around and answered my question like this: "That's our Nevsky you've got in front of you. For now, it's only on paper, but eventually the whole city will be that way." And then the door closed. For the umpteenth time, the journalist bent over to examine the design and marveled at its amazing beauty. The design showed the houses along Nevsky Prospect no longer one right smack up against the other, forming a continuous stone wall. Some of the old buildings were still there, but every other building had been taken down. In place of the raised houses, there were now marvelous green and fragrant oases. Birds were shown nesting in the many birches, pines, and cedars, and it seemed as though one could hear their song just from looking at the drawing. The people sitting on benches beneath the shady trees were surrounded by beautiful flower beds, as well as raspberry and currant bushes. These green oases jutted out a little into the street, and the Nevsky no longer looked like a stone trench, but a splendid living green alley. The building facades had a multitude of mirrors built into them. The thousands of splashes of sunlight reflected in the mirrors played with the passers-by, caressed the petals of the flowers, and played in the streams of the little fountains set up in each green oasis. People were shown drinking water along with the splashes of sunlight and smiling. "Anastasía," I asked, "did the boy ever show up again?" "What boy?" "You know, the one who kept pestering the editors with his question?" The boy was gone for good. He became a great architect. Together with his like-minded chums, he created a splendid cities of the future, cities and villages in which happy people began to live. But his first marvelous creation was the city he designed on the Neva. "Anastasía, in what year will Russia's marvelous future appear?" "You can determine the year for yourself, Vladimir." "What do you mean for myself? Is time subject to man's will?" "What man does in his time is definitely subject to his will. Everything created by a dream already exists in space. The dream of many human souls, your readers, will turn the divine dream into material reality. What you could have seen come about in 300 years, or could come right now, this instant." "Right this instant? But you can't build a house in an instant, and a garden won't grow up even in a year." "But if you, right where you are living at the moment, even if it is just a tiny flat, plant a seed in a little clay pot of earth, from which may grow a shoot of a family tree, this tree will eventually grow to maturity in your future family domain. You yourself are talking about what will be. That's not the same thing as right now. In other words, a dream cannot materialize itself in a single instant." "What do you mean it cannot? After all, that material seed you plant, that is precisely the beginning of the dream's coming true. The shoot interacts with the whole universe. It materializes your dream, and you will be unfolded by splendid, bright energies. You will stand before the Father as the embodiment of his dream." "Interesting indeed. That means we should get started right away?" "Of course. Only where can I find the right words to get people to understand?" "The words will be found if you can be sincere and true to yourself in front of people." "I don't know how, but I shall act. Your dream has sparked something in my soul, Anastasía, and I very much want to make the future I have seen come true." Chapter 15. Making it come true. First of all, I had to determine whether there were any people willing to get involved in the building of an eco-community, and then to work in it. I asked the Anastasía Foundation for Cultural and Assistance to Creativity, based in Vladimir, to circulate information on the building of an eco-village according to Anastasia's design. A scant 2 months later, 139 people had responded declaring their interest in building the future community, including Russians who had emigrated abroad. Once this book is out, telling about the future of Russia and giving information on Russians' new lifestyle, that number may well rise 100 or 1,000-fold, and be spread over a number of regions of the country. Hence, the organizational work of building the community should be able to start in different regions at the same time. In regard to this, the Anastasía Foundation, which as an information clearinghouse has reviewed the existing laws on the subject and suggested that any readers sharing Anastasia's views proceed as follows. First, start with your own region by organizing a spearhead group that could eventually be given legal status in accordance with prevailing legislation. Some regions possibly already have readers' clubs or community organizations bringing Anastasia's readers together, which could get the project off the ground there. But if you don't happen to know of anything like that in your region, you can get in touch with the Anastasía Foundation, which receives a lot of correspondence on this and can provide you with addresses. Overall, I have a lot of faith in entrepreneurs. They have more experience in organizational matters, and so, even if community organizations are already set up in some areas, you should still try and get in touch with entrepreneurs. You should appoint an authorized representative, at least temporarily or on a trial basis, someone who can act on your behalf in dealing with the authorities, submitting applications for land allotments, calling meetings when required, etc. Provide a small honorarium for your chairperson. The representative's role can be filled either by an actual person or a corporate body. In the latter case, you might want to appoint, for example, a well-known construction company, which could subsequently enjoy priority rights in the awarding of contracts for erecting single-family houses, as well as in infrastructure buildings. Such a major contract will be extremely profitable for the construction company, and so it may agree to take on the job of applying for land use permits and compiling budget estimates. Second, submit a formal application to your region's local public authorities, and directly to the official at the top, for a single allotment of land with an area of no less than 150 acres. The size of the allotment will depend on how many interested participants you have, as well as what kind of local resources are available. You will need to consider that the future of your community will be home to quite a few families, so it should include a school, club, and medical facility, and these are best supported by a significant number of people. Small communities may not be in a position to create the required infrastructure. Third, in applying for an allotment, you should contract land surveyors, architects, and builders to draft blueprints for the settlement. Another important reason for this is that you will need to find out the depth of the water table under the allotment, with a view to drilling wells to supply each house with running water, to determine what depth the house foundation should be, as well as the feasibility of constructing a small pond in each domain. Drawing up a good overall plan for the community is also important in determining the location of the future school and play areas, as well as where the access roads should go. The Anastasía Foundation has already commissioned competent specialists to work out a model plan, and if it is completed before you launch your spearhead group, you can consult with the foundation. It will cost you less, but then you will have to adapt the model to your own locale, introduce your own modifications, and share them with other spearhead groups. Successful proposals which have the greatest appeal will be adopted by other groups, and eventually we shall jointly put together a master design. Fourth, after completing the design for the settlement, and this is something not only specialists but also future residents can participate in, you will receive a detailed set of schematics, including an overall plan highlighting the individual plots of at least 1 hectare each. Every participant should be formally assigned a plot of land, perhaps by drawing straws. Land use entitlement should be formalized with an appropriate legal document. drawn up in the name of the individual owner rather than the organization, as was the case in Auroville community in India. And so here you are standing on your own plot, on your very own hectare of land. This is your kin's domain, the place where your descendants will be born and will live. They will fondly remember its founder, their family patriarch, and they may even rebuke him for certain mistakes in planning out the place. Right at the moment of the design, everything will be situated on the assigned plot. It's completely up to you. Where will you place your family tree? An oak or cedar, for example, which will keep on growing for as long as 550 years, and may be looked upon by the 9th generation of your descendants as they remember you. Where will you decide to dig a pond, plant an orchard and a small grove of woodland trees, build your house and set up your flower beds? What kind of living fence will you create around the perimeter of your kin's domain? Maybe the one Anastasía described, or maybe it will come out even more fanciful and functional than the one depicted in my previous book. It can be started even now, even before you get the official documents, even before a spearhead group is organized among the people who share your vision. You can start the building process in your thoughts, pondering what will go in each corner of your future kin's domain. You should remember that the house you build, even one of fairly solid construction, will last about 100 years and then fall into disrepair. The living structures you set up, on the other hand, will only become better and stronger, thriving more and more as the ages pass. They will convey your living thoughts to your descendants for centuries, and perhaps even for millennia to come. You can start building right away, and not just in your thoughts. Even now you can plant the seed of your future majestic family tree in a clay pot on the windowsill. Of course, you can also buy grown saplings already for transplant at a specialist nursery, or dig up young shoots in the forest without damaging the growth around, especially in places where the forest growth needs thinning out. That is possible, of course, but I think Anastasía is correct here. It's better to grow the sapling on your own, especially when it comes to your future family tree. A sapling from a commercial nursery is like a baby from an orphanage. Besides, you need to grow not only one sapling, but several different ones. And before planting the seed in the plot of earth, you need to infuse the little seed with information about yourself. I realize that support on a national level may be needed to overcome bureaucratic obstacles in certain regions, or if not support, then at least in absence of opposition. Appropriate changes in legislative policies are required. Instead of waiting around idly for this to happen all by itself, waiting for at least one of our existing political bodies to mature into a state where it will support such a project, the Anastasía Foundation, at my request, has worked out a draft constitution for a new political party, a party of land users. This germinating social movement has been called co-creation. Its platform, which still has to be discussed and finalized, comes down to one central theme, as I see it. The state should grant every willing family 1 hectare of land for lifetime use, for the purpose of establishing their own family domain. This movement is still young, and nobody is really in control of it at the moment. But I think that in time we shall see literate politicians coming on board who are capable of working out a relationship to the new movement on the level of federal policy making. For the time being, the Co-Creation Party functions mainly as an informal clearinghouse. A legal department will get started as soon as sufficient funds become available. For now, the party's administrative affairs are being handled by the Anastasía Foundation for Culture and Assistance to Creativity. The regional spearhead groups set up to organize new communities will be quite successful after they gain the support of the local public authorities. This should happen once the authorities see the substantive benefits which will accrue to their region. And these can be pinpointed right now. They do exist, and they are indeed substantive. Try to get a discussion of the project going in the local press and see if you can get specialists, ecologists, economists, and sociologists to weigh in on the specific influences the project will have in your region. In an effort to do my part to help, at least in some way, in getting land allotted for the purpose of setting up kin's domains, I have decided to publish in this book an open letter to the President of Russia. Chapter 16. Open Letter. To Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, President of the Russian Federation. From Vladimir Nikolaevich Megré, Citizen of the Russian Federation. Dear Vladimir Vladimirovich, we live in a generation which must be very lucky indeed. We have before us a real opportunity to begin building a prosperous, flourishing state thoroughly protected from external aggressors, internal conflicts, and crime. A state in which happy families will live in prosperity. Our generation has the opportunity of not only building a splendid country, but of actually living in it, provided there is enough goodwill among the legislative powers that be to grant every willing family 1 hectare of land for the purpose of establishing thereon its own kin's domain. This simple action will suffice to call forth an impulse to creative endeavor on the part of the majority of people at various levels of society. The land should be granted free of charge for lifetime use, with the right of inheritance. The produce grown on these kin's domain should not be subject to any form of taxation. You will agree, Vladimir Vladimirovich, that an abnormal, illogical state of affairs has now come about. Every Russian is supposed to have a motherland, but nobody can show exactly where his piece of this motherland is. If every family receives one and transforms it into a flourishing corner of paradise, Russia as a whole will become a magnificent land. Current policies on national development do not inspire people into creativity, since it is not clear where or to what kind of future they are leading. The forging of a democratic, economically developed state on the Western model has been rejected, intuitively perhaps, by the majority of the population, and I think this is all to the good. Common sense makes us ask ourselves, why should any of us in particular, or we as a nation, waste our efforts on building a state which will only be racked by drugs, prostitution, and gangsterism? All those things are part of Western society. We used to think that the so-called developed societies enjoyed an abundance of food products, but now it is clear that this abundance has been achieved at the expense of applying all sorts of chemical additives and poisonous chemicals to the soil as well as genetic engineering. We have seen that imported food products have nowhere near the taste quality of our own. In Germany, for example, people gladly buy potatoes brought in from Russia. In a number of countries, the government has become concerned over the situation and mandated special labeling of genetically modified produce. Scientists, too, are becoming more and more concerned. America and Germany are among those countries that have the highest per capita cancer rates in the world. Do we have to go down the same path? I don't think it is a path that inspires very many people, but our country has come to tolerate the promotion of foreign goods and the Western way of life. We have become resigned to the appearance in our midst of more and more diseases, to the fact that we can now drink water only out of bottles we buy at the store, and that the population of Russia is decreasing by 750,000 souls a year. It's all just like in the West. After all, the birth rate has fallen in highly developed countries too. We are trying our hardest to be like them, but I have been hearing from people who live in these countries, hearing about their hopes that Russia is searching for and will inevitably find its own path of development, and show the whole world a happier way of life. Mr. President, you, no doubt, have received various proposals for the future development of our country. If this new proposal appears questionable in comparison with others you have seen, I would ask you to test it on an experimental basis in regions where the respective governors can discern in it a grain of common sense. You will find further details of this proposal in the series of books entitled The Ringing Cedars of Russia, of which I happen to be the author. I would not imagine that you have had the time to read them personally, caught up as you are in attending to a flood of affairs of state. Still, there are certain appropriate administrative bodies which are aware of these books and have already rendered their verdict. They conclude that these books have engendered a new religion in Russia, which is spreading like wildfire, an opinion that is also being circulated in the press in a number of publications. Their conclusion came as a complete surprise to me. While I have expressed my feelings about God in these books, I never thought of creating any kind of new religion. I simply wrote books about an extraordinary and beautiful recluse living in the Siberian taiga, and the fervent dream she entertains about what is splendid and beautiful in life. One could say that the enthusiastic reaction on the part of people of different social backgrounds and the popularity of these books both in Russia and abroad bear some resemblance to a religious phenomenon, but I think this is quite a different story here. The ideas, philosophy, and topical awareness of the Siberian recluse, not to mention the language in which she expresses herself, have all deeply stirred people's hearts. It will probably be quite a while before scientists reach a unanimous conclusion on who Anastasía is, and what is the full significance of the books containing her sayings, or how one should interpret the public reaction to them. Let them keep on trying to figure it out. I am only concerned lest their theoretical analysis overshadow the concrete proposals made by Anastasía. Vladimir Vladimirovich, so that you may be personally persuaded by the effectiveness of Anastasia's proposals regarding the land, I invite you to authorize an experiment, regardless of who either Anastasía or Vladimir Megré may be, which will put some of her less significant statements to the test. First, I suggest that your public officials will not be unduly burdened if asked to commission an appropriate scientific research institute to do a simple analysis of the effectiveness of Anastasia's proposal on cleansing the air in major cities from harmful dust pollution. The gist of this proposal was set forth back in my first book. Second, I recommend you authorize an analysis of Siberian cedar nut oil as a general remedial agent. Both data from ancient sources and modern research by scientists at the University of Tomsk confirm Anastasia's statement that this natural product, provided it is obtained through a specific technological method, is one of the most effective remedies in the world for the cure of a broad range of diseases. You will not find anywhere else on the globe a vaster array of plantings than in Siberia, which is home to the nut-bearing cedar. The Russian federal budget could realize substantial profits from putting this product on the international market, as well as from its use within our own country. We need to have a state policy on the exploitation of Siberian flora, a policy aimed not at the establishment of a large-scale industrial enterprises, but at the unfolding of a network of small businesses involving people actually living in the remote regions of Siberia. The implementation of such a policy does not require a huge outlay of capital, only a legislative decision allowing the local residents to acquire land in the taiga on a long-term leave basis. Moreover, Vladimir Vladimirovich, life inevitably confirms even the statements of Anastasia's that seem less plausible at first glance. Personally, I am absolutely convinced of our country's splendid future. It is only a question of whether those living today will accelerate its coming or slow it down. I sincerely wish you, Vladimir Vladimirovich, along with all of us alive today, the opportunity of being the creators of this splendid future. Respectfully, Vladimir Megré. Chapter 17. Questions and Answers. Anastasia's design intrigued me. I wanted to think and talk about it on a daily basis. I wanted to stand up for it at all costs, defend it against ridicule, and dispel the doubts of the skeptics. I talked about it at the readers' conferences held in the city of Gelendzhik, at the Central Letters Club in Moscow. The majority of the participants at these conferences, there were more than 2,000 in all, hailing from various countries of the Commonwealth of Independent States, as well as from further afield, either supported this design or at least expressed an interest. But in this chapter, I shall reproduce some of the basic questions and comments by the doubters, along with my responses to them, based on Anastasia's statements and my own convictions, as well as information I have managed to glean from other sources. Question. In today's world, no nation's economy can survive independent of the global economic system. Today's economic processes point to the need to create large industrial structures, the need for specialized knowledge of today's markets and how they are set up, as well as the major directions of capital flow. It does not appear that you have training in economics. Your proposal involves emphasizing small-scale commodity production, which may take away from more important things and ruin the national economy. Answer. It is true that I have no training in economics, but as to your point that large conglomerates are of prime importance to the nation's economy, I am in complete agreement with you. I think you will also agree that a large factory, say, is economically viable for the nation only when it operates to produce goods in high demand. When a large enterprise shuts down, and such cases are not infrequent in our country or in others, it inevitably means losses. The state is obliged to pay workers unemployment benefits. Hundreds of thousands are forced to eke out to a wretched existence on the strength of this paltry allowance. They don't know what to do. They're so used to relying on their production line job to feed themselves and their families. Given these conditions, they can make better use of their new free time working intensively on their own plots of land. One's family domain is not just to provide a home base to spend one's leisure time in. It can also serve as a profitable workplace, more profitable even than in many enterprises, even major ones. In terms of the larger picture, on the national level, that is, the state may be seen not only made up of industrial and financial conglomerates, both large and small, but its very building blocks consist precisely of these family nuclei. For any family, the domain can serve as a home base, an insurance policy against any possible form of nationwide economic disaster. I don't see anything wrong with each family being offered the opportunity to provide independently for its own poverty-free existence. I also believe that personal freedom is impossible without economic freedom. A working family, even one living in a modern city apartment, cannot be free, dependent as it is on an employer who determines one's salary, on utility companies with the power to supply or withhold heat, water, and electricity, on the availability of groceries, and on the prices of food products and consumer services. The family is slave to all of these, and the children in such families are born into a slave mentality. Question. Russia is an industrially developed country and a mighty nuclear power, and only as such will it be able to guarantee the security of its citizens. If all its residents do nothing but work the land, the country will be transformed into a purely agrarian state and thus become defenseless against external aggressors. Answer. I don't think everybody's necessarily going to agree to work on their plots of land right off the bat. It'll be a gradual process, and the situation will unfold naturally in an orderly manner. National power depends not only on possessing a sufficient number of nuclear warheads, but also on the overall economic state of affairs, including sufficiency and quality of food products. And when a state does not have sufficient food production to feed its people, it is then obliged to sell off not only its natural resources, but its armaments as well, thereby strengthening the position of any potential aggressor. The proposed design has the power to strengthen the economic position of the state as a whole, and as such offers the opportunity not only for more effective scientific and industrial development, but also a more efficient combat-ready army. In the near future, however, when this way of life has been adopted on a massive scale, I think, indeed, I am quite convinced, that it will provoke considerable interest among many citizens of other countries, including countries we don't currently get along with. And people in those nations, too, will want to reshape their lifestyle in the same way Russians have done. The adoption of this design in a variety of countries will signal the start of a whole new era of peaceful existence among peoples. Question. The implementation of the proposal is feasible, of course, in the more trouble-free regions of Russia. But isn't it naive to think that of implementing it in an inherently crime-prone republic such as Chechnya? Answer. A significant lowering of social tensions, especially in the so-called hot spots, along with complete cessation of conflict through the help of the proposed project, I see as something not only not naive, but absolutely realistic. If you take the Northern Caucasus, for example, and its most troubled region, Chechnya, It has recently become clear, and this has been reported in the press, that the basic conflict is centered around the struggle of small groups of people for control of the Republic's oil reserves, as well as for money and power. This situation is typical of most of the hotspots today, indeed of most of the conflicts the world has known throughout the ages. That still leaves the question of why such a large part of the population, especially men, has been drawn into the Chechen conflict. Chechnya used to have hundreds of illegal oil refining operations belonging to a small group of people. Tens of thousands of people from among the local population worked in these enterprises. When the government tried to restore law and order, these people lost their jobs, leaving their families without any means of support. The principal aim of this class of people in joining the militants was to try and protect their jobs and the welfare of their families. Minimal though it was, besides, their participation in the rebel forces wasn't exactly volunteer work. They ended up earning quite a bit more than the unemployment benefit they had been getting. Consequently, for the majority of the ordinary fighters, taking part in the armed gangs was simply a job, no different from being a policeman or a Russian army officer, only better paid. As a result, many of these foot soldiers don't see much in the way of hope for their family's welfare if military options were to cease. How can we possibly do away with unemployment in Chechnya if we can't completely do away with it in even a single region closer to home, especially one that is comparatively well off? Let's say the government pours colossal resources into Chechnya and starts setting up all sorts of enterprises there to guarantee a job for everyone who wants one. But then another problem arises, the size of the pay packet offered. Say you offer a special raise for the Chechen population, then all of Russia will be working to support the Chechens, since the only way the raise can be implemented is on the backs of the Russian taxpayer as a whole. Even then, not all of the money will reach its intended target, since the problem of getting allocated funds through those who actually need them has not been resolved. In sum, we'd be faced with the same situation we have today, only with a significant increase in expenditures. The Chechen Republic is a region favorable to agricultural production. Now, let's suppose a law granting land for family domain is already in effect. Suppose that the state is able to protect these family domains from any kind of encroachment. So a Chechen family receives land for its kin's domain, where everything they produce belongs exclusively to them and their future descendants, guaranteeing them a poverty-free existence and a life not ruled by bombs and not as outlaws, but in their own splendid corner of the earth, a piece of their motherland, which they have established themselves. I am certain that such a family will not oppose a government which has given them an opportunity like that. On the contrary, they will defend such a government more zealously than they now oppose it. They will defend such a government as passionately as they would defend their family nest. They will counter any attempt by agitators to separate Chechnya from such a government, or any attempt at racial discrimination. I am convinced that if the government launched a campaign on the sufficiently large scale, introducing settlements like that into Chechen territory, even on an experimental basis, the hotspot we call Chechnya will be transformed into not only one of the most stable regions of Russia, but one of the major centers of spirituality on the earth. We shall see a complete 180-degree turn. When Anastasía spoke of ways to eliminate crime, I too had a hard time believing what she said. But eventually, life inevitably kept bearing out the truth of her words, and as far as the Chechen Republic is concerned. At the Readers' Conference in Gelendzhik, there were more than 1,000 people from all parts of Russia and the Commonwealth of Independent States. I was especially struck by the fact that a delegation had come from Chechnya. Nobody had invited them specially to the conference. The Chechens came all on their own. Later I spoke with several of them personally. At the moment, we are talking about Chechnya. But are other parts of our country free of crime? It's there, all right. And in just about every form you can imagine. One of the causes of crime is unemployment, and the fact that people are released from prison with no opportunity to rebuild their lives in our society. Anastasia's project is capable of solving this problem. Question. If you give a hectare of land to everybody in Russia who wants one, there won't be enough land to go around, especially for the rising generation. Answer. At the present time, we are faced with a question even more acute, namely that there are not enough people to work the land. And I'm not talking just about wasteland and land unsuitable for farming, but arable land as well. As to the rising generation, it is unfortunately the case that every year more Russians are dying than are being born. According to Goskomstat, the government statistic agency, the Russian population is showing an annual attrition rate of 750,000 people. So the current concern is over whether there will be a rising generation at all. At first, I too was under the misconception that a family, or even a single person living, let's say, in a flat or in a 5-story apartment block, takes up less land than a family or a person with a private house and a garden plot. But as it turns out, it's not that way at all. Any person, no matter what floor he lives on, consumes as food all sorts of things that grow on the land. To get those growing things delivered to him, roads, trucks, warehouses, and stores are required. And all of these take up land space too. So at any given moment, every individual is being supported by his own plot of land. It supports him regardless of whether the individual has abandoned it or even thinks about it at all. Naturally, I wasn't able to give a full answer to this question right off, as I did not have immediate access to all the figures, but I looked them up later and can now include them here. Russia's land. The total landmass of the Russian Federation comprises nearly of 1,710 million hectares, of which only 667.7 million hectares are fit for agricultural production. Figures for the beginning of 1996 show 222 million hectares used for farming at the time, or 13% of Russia's total land resources. Of these, 130.2 million hectares, 7.6% of the total, were classified as arable land. At the present time, Russia's population comprises of 147 million people. Hence, the problem of allocating a hectare of land to any family wishing to have one simply doesn't exist. According to the statistics, moreover, the real problem is quite the opposite. The population of our country is shrinking drastically. And here's what the analysts have to say in regard to the general state of the Russian population. If current trends continue, between 2000 and 2045, the number of children under 15 years of age will be cut in half, while the number of senior citizens will increase by 50%. The capacity of the population to reproduce itself will be pretty much exhausted. Oh yes, and one more problem: the quality of the arable lands in our country. Large areas of the nation are witnessing topsoil erosion. Specialists are of the opinion that these processes have already reached a critical stage at the regional and interregional levels. In all of Russia's agricultural zones, erosion, or the threat of erosion, has affected 117 million hectares, or 63% of all agricultural lands. Over the last 50 years, the rate of erosion has increased by a factor of 30. The rise has been especially steep since the onset of the 1990s. According to the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, experts, Russia is among the top 10 countries of the world in terms of erosion rates, and by 2002, erosion will affect as much as 75% of our farmland. I could go on and cite even more detailed statistics about our country's land. They're all pretty miserable. I shall include them at the end of this book. Now, after becoming familiar with the statistics cited above, I can confidently state that Anastasia's project is capable of stopping the drunken orgy our nation is indulging in with its land resources. To this day, it is the only effective and feasible project in existence. It envisages the restoration of the soil's fertility through natural processes. It does not require additional capital outlays on the government's part, and yet with one fell swoop solves the problems of ecology, refugees, and unemployment, and completely eliminates the problems we today are creating for our children by our attitude to the land. Perhaps there is somewhere in nature a more effective and feasible project. In that case, let it be brought forward. At the moment, all some agencies are doing is demanding more money for the restoration of agricultural production by outmoded means. The government does not have the money they require. But the saddest scenario would be for such plans to be realized by borrowing money abroad and having chemical fertilizers poked into the soil to its further detriment, since we do not have sufficient quantities of manure to go around. That money will have to be repaid with interest. The condition of the land will deteriorate even further, and the whole problem will fall on the shoulders of the rising generation. I shall do all I can to promote Anastasia's project. Of course, government officials will hardly accept a recluse from the taiga as an authority, and I am no specialist in agriculture, and so it will be a challenge for me to prove its effectiveness before our worldly-wise politicos. But nevertheless, I shall keep on trying with all the means at my disposal. I will be most grateful to those readers who are familiar with the intrigues of the workings of our government if they can explain in a more professional language the effectiveness of Anastasia's project to our high-ranking government officials. Perhaps this book will find its way, too, into the hands of government agencies empowered to undertake such measures, and so I am appealing to them once more with a declaration on behalf of all willing participants. I don't know how many willing participants there are, but I am certain that their numbers are in the millions. On their behalf, I make the following request, namely, that the Russian government settle the land questions on a legislative basis and grant each willing family in our nation 1 hectare of land free of charge, affording the opportunity to each willing family to establish its own kin's domain. Dignify it and lovingly care for its own piece of motherland, thereby making the motherland as a whole beautiful and happy. The motherland, after all, consists of little pieces. Question. In many regions of our country, the ecological situation is extremely complex. One could even call it disastrous today. Wouldn't it be better to first direct our efforts toward the improvement of ecological conditions in general, as many ecological organizations are doing at the moment, before turning our attention to individual domains? Answer. You yourself say that there are a lot of organizations focusing on the ecological situation, but it is getting worse. Doesn't this mean that simply focusing attention on it is not enough here? Since the situation is continuing to deteriorate and even reaching disastrous proportions. Let us imagine a beautiful garden with all different kinds of trees growing in just one splendidly laid out domain. Just one little corner of paradise, only 1 hectare in size. Of course, that's not sufficient for global change, either for a country or the planet. But now let us imagine 1,000,000 of such little corners, and we shall see the whole earth as a flourishing garden of paradise. But still, it is up to each one of us in particular to start by setting up our own little corner. Perhaps then we shall be able to go from being totally focused on the subject to being totally involved in concrete actions. Question. Do you believe that unemployed families can get rich with the help of a single hectare of their own land? If you believe that, then tell me why today's rural areas are at a standstill. People in these rural areas have land, but they're still going hungry. Answer. Let's consider this phenomenon together, but first I want to add a few more questions to the one you asked. Why do millions of people say that for them 400 or 500 square meters of a dacha plot has been a significant help to them in financial terms, significantly increasing the amount of food available to them, and yet rural residents with 1,500 to 2,500 square meters call themselves poor and starving? Why, in addition to other factors, doesn't the state of our well-being also depend on our level of conscious awareness? The majority of the rural population thinks that you can have a good life only in the cities, and that's why you've got so many young people leaving the rural areas altogether. I think our own recent propaganda is at least partially to blame. I'm sure you remember those glowing articles in the Soviet press in the 50s and 60s. Who were the heroes back then? Miners, lumberjacks, machine operators, airplane pilots, sailors. Even paintings of cityscapes invariably featured a host of smoking chimneys and industrial giants. There was occasionally a condescending reference to the collective farmer, but a man tending his own garden plot was always negatively portrayed. They even tried building city-type apartment blocks in rural areas, thereby depriving people of their own backyard, and made them work only on so-called communal land. Just as with the Oroville community in India, you could live on the land and cultivate it, but you still couldn't have any land to call your own. All of which leads to some pretty sad results. You hear constant talk from both politicians and the media of the widespread poverty in the Russian countryside today, just as in the majority of the population at large. There's so much talk about it that everybody in mass ends up convinced that if you live in the countryside, you must be poor. There are hardly any examples cited indicating that your well-being largely depends on you. It must be in somebody's interest to keep rehearsing the scenario. Don't rely on yourself. I am the only one that can make you happy. That's what you hear from a lot of religious leaders, as well as a lot of politicians gathering their own circle of voters around them. If you want to be poor and destitute, you can go right on believing them. I want to talk about not how to be poor, but how to be rich. When someone asks me if it is possible to live above the poverty line with one's own parcel of land, I answer yes. And here's a concrete example. In 1999, an acquaintance of mine, a Moscow entrepreneur who had read Anastasía, invited me over for a visit. He intrigued me when he said that he could prepare a table almost identical to the one Anastasía had set before me in the taiga. When I arrived, his dining table was still empty. We sat down and chatted, and Andriy, that was the entrepreneur's name, kept looking at the clock, apologizing for someone he was expecting being held up. Before long, his chauffeur arrived with 2 large baskets. The table was soon spread with tomatoes, cucumbers, bread, and much else besides. The room was filled with tempting aromas. In a few minutes, the women in Andriy's house had laid out a splendid table. No Pepsi-Cola to drink, but some marvelous, fragrant Russian kvass. Instead of French cognac, there was homemade wine. On top of it all, infused with some sort of herbs. The tomatoes and cucumbers were not as splendid as the ones Anastasía had in the taiga, but they were far tastier than what you could get in the supermarket or even at farmers' markets. "Where did you get all this from?" I asked Andriy in astonishment, and this is what he told me. At some point, on their way back to Moscow, from Ryazan, Andriy's chauffeur had stopped the jeep at a small roadside market. They bought a liter jar of pickles and a jar of tomatoes, turning into a small cafe. They decided to have a decent meal. They opened the jars they had bought and took a taste. After lunch, Andriy told his driver to turn around and go back to the roadside market. He bought from the elderly woman behind the table everything she had and offered to give her a ride home in his jeep. The woman lived all alone in a rather old-looking cottage with a small vegetable garden. Her lot was situated in a wee village about 15 kilometers from the main road. Andriy's enterprising mind was already working quickly, and here is how things unfolded. Andriy purchased the house in the countryside with 2,000 square meters of land on the edge of a forest, about 120 kilometers from Moscow, in an ecologically clean zone. He registered the house in the name of this woman, presented her with the documents and contract obligating him to pay her a monthly amount of $300, while the woman in turn was to give the produce from her garden to his family, except for what she ate herself. The woman's name was Narisna Ivanovna. She was 61 years old, and she really didn't understand documents or believe in them. Then Andriy took her to the local rural council and asked the chairman to read the documents and assure her that they were in order from a legal standpoint. The rural council chairman read over the documents and said to the woman, "What have you got to lose, Ivana? Nobody's asking you to give up that tumble-down hut of yours, so if you don't like it, you can always come back." Narisna Ivanovna was finally persuaded to accept the offer. For the past 3 years, she's been living in a well-built house. Andriy hired workers to dig her a well and put in a heating system with a hot water furnace. They also dug and outfitted a vegetable cellar. They put a fence around the whole property, brought in all the furnishings she needed along with a goat, some chickens, and animal feed, as well as a lot of other things needed to set up a home. Nadizhda Ivanovna's daughter and wee granddaughter came to live with her. Since Andrei has read what Anastasía had to say about vegetable growing, he cultivates seedlings himself, but only with seeds he obtained from Nadezhda Ivanovna. Each summer, Andrei's father, a retired restaurant manager, takes the seedlings out to her home and gladly helps the woman with the garden work. This arrangement has provided both Nadezhda Ivanovna and her daughter with work and a place to live. Andrei and his family, his wife, their 2 children, and his father, are supplied all summer long with fresh fruits and vegetables, which are really eco-clean, along with marvelous marinated produce during the winter. And all year long they have access to health-giving herbs whenever they need them. Maybe someone will say that the example I have cited is an exception. Nothing of the sort. 10 years back, when I was president of the Interregional Association of Siberian Entrepreneurs, many of its members tried to set up their own household plots, either for their companies or just for their families. Today you can find such services advertised in the papers. Only there is one but. It is very hard to find any capable workers, or rather anyone who is competent to do what Nadezhda Ivanovna did. And since such people are so hard to find, let's recall for ourselves what attitude we should cultivate toward the land. Let's share our experiences of how to be rich and happy on our own land, and not how to be poor. Question. Vladimir Nikolaevich, I'm an entrepreneur. I too happen to know that many well-off people use the services of rural residents who are experts at cultivating and preserving agricultural produce, which is definitely superior in taste and quality to what comes out of the large-scale enterprises. But if everybody follows the same path, that will mean a saturation of the market. And then, how is a family going to survive on income just from its own hectare of land if it turns out that nobody needs the tomatoes and cucumbers they grow? Answer. The land yields not just tomatoes and cucumbers, but much more besides. However, even if half of the total number of Russian families have their own domains, they still won't be able to satisfy the demand for their produce over the next 20 or 30 years, since the demand will come not just from Russians, but from many people abroad, especially in the rich developed countries. The reason is that agricultural producers in most countries have got so caught up in the business of artificial selection and chemical treatment of crops that the original form of these crops has simply got lost. And I'm not just referring to how they look, but to the fullness of their content. The example of cucumbers, tomatoes, though, gives everyone a chance to be convinced independently of the following. Go into any average supermarket, or better still, into an upscale supermarket. There are quite a few these days in our big cities, and you will see very beautiful imported tomatoes and cucumbers priced from 30 rubles per kilogram. They are uniform in size and a treat for the eyes, and sometimes they're sold with little green stems left on. But there's no aroma and no taste. They're mutants. They're an illusion, a mock-up, only an external reminder of what ought to be there. Most of the world today feeds on such mutants. This is not my discovery. It's something people are concerned about in many of what we call developed countries of the world. A decree was passed in Germany, for example, mandating product labeling to include information about the presence of artificial additives, and people who can afford to are boycotting these products. Products grown in eco-clean regions using only limited quantities of chemical fertilizers cost a lot dearer in the West. Only the current Western agricultural system does not permit farmers to grow produce that is ecologically clean through and through. Farmers in Western countries are obliged to use not only hired labor, but all sorts of technology besides, including weed-destroying chemicals and chemical fertilizers, in their efforts to maximize their profit margins. Let's say a Western farmer, and there are some of these already, wants to grow an eco-clean produce, and even take what Anastasía said into account. You may remember she said that it wasn't necessary to destroy all the weeds. since they too perform significant functions. But let's say a farmer still wants to grow this kind of produce, if only for his family and friends. Right off, he's faced with a challenging problem: seeds. Artificial selection has done its work. The original varieties have long since disappeared in the West, and there are few of them even left in Russia, especially after imported seed stock was allowed in the Russian market. If people use their own seed stocks, the variety of vegetables will gradually see a restoration of their original properties, drawing from the soil everything needed by man. But a complete restoration will take decades. In Russia, possibly thanks to both poverty and the abundance of small private plots, many people are using their own seeds, and this turns out to be their greatest asset, the effects of which will soon be multiplied 100-fold in monetary terms. We're talking about seeds, about the necessity of growing crops in eco-clean zones and the avoidance of chemical fertilizers. All this is very good, but something they're talking about a lot in a lot of countries. But that's it, only talk. There's still a very real shortage of healthful and tasty agricultural produce in the world, especially in the developed countries. But that's not all. The processing and preserving are of the utmost importance. In spite of all the efforts of our technocratic world, our highly equipped technological complexes are unable to match many Russian grandmothers in their production of marinated tomatoes, cucumbers, and cabbages of superior taste quality. What's the secret? Apart from the many pearls of wisdom, few people realize that once the tomatoes and cucumbers are plucked from the beds they have been growing in, no more than 15 minutes should go by before they are sealed in preserving jars. The shorter this period, the better. This is what preserves the marvelous aroma, the ethers, and the aura. The same applies to the additives. Dill, for example. Water is extremely important. What good can we possibly derive from using chlorinated dead water? We can boil it, steam the jars, but there are people who take spring water and add huckleberries among other things. Would you like to try it yourselves? Just take a tumbler, fill it a third full of huckleberries, then fill it up with spring water, and you will be able to enjoy drinking this water even 6 months later. You will also notice the strikingly distinctive, superior quality of the fruits and vegetables preserved for the winter, 1 jar at a time, by these many Russian Cracker Jacks. These products' preeminence in quality of taste over produce from even the most well-known food companies in the world is something each one of us can confirm for ourselves by simply comparing the two. Now let's say a family living in its domain has canned 1,000-liter jars of tomato and cucumbers. The result is first-class produce, surpassing all others in many respects. In terms of taste and quality and eco-clean production, there is none like it anywhere on the planet. This produce becomes a highly desirable commodity for the tables of many consumers in various countries of the world, including American billionaires and tourists at Cyprus-famed hotels, resorts. And it will say on the labels, from Ivanov's domain, from Petrov's domain, from Cedarov's domain, etc. Of course, entrepreneurs won't be interested in selling just 1,000-liter jars, but let's say there are 300 family domains in a community. They would end up with 300,000 jars, and that would get a major business firm's attention. I would imagine that initially a jar would cost the same as one currently in the supermarket, somewhere around $1. But once people actually taste it, the price will go up, maybe as much as 12 times. I mentioned cucumbers and tomatoes just an example. There's a whole lot of things that a domain can produce. For example, wines, liqueurs, sweet berry wines from currants, raspberries, blackberries, sweet rowan berries, and so much else besides. Each person can make up their own bouquet, improving it more and more as time goes on. And no super expertise elite wines will be able to compete with them. There aren't any wine-making materials anywhere in the world like those you can get in Russia. Besides, wines can be prepared using herbs according to ancient recipes and can be made healthful and vitamin-enriched. Anastasía says that soon the hand-embroidered Russian kosovrotka will be considered the most fashionable garment in the world. So this is another line to think along. During the winter months, families can prepare handmade wood carvings. It all comes down to the folk sayings, if you want to be happy, be it. You could also say, if you want to be rich, be it. The main thing is not to program yourself for poverty. You should attune your expectations to wealth. It makes a lot more sense to think about how to become wealthy and not constantly tell yourself it's impossible. Question. Anastasía maintains that it is a lot easier for young couples to hold on to their love for each other in a domain such as you describe than in a typical apartment. Please tell me whether you have discussed this point with psychologists or people who research family problems. And if so, what do they have to say about this, and what makes it happen? Answer. I haven't talked about this with any academics. Just what precisely makes the love last longer is not something that frightfully interests me. The main thing is that it hangs in there. The fact that it happens is something you could possibly confirm for yourself after thinking it over. Consider where you would like to see your own son or daughter living, in a city flat, which is like a sack made of stone, or in a house surrounded with a magnificent garden. Consider what you would like to feed your daughter or your son or grandchildren, tinned goods or fresh, ecologically clean produce. And in the long term, do you want to see your children living healthy lives or living off the local pharmacy? Ask any young woman who, other things being equal, she would prefer to marry someone who had set up his life and future family nest in a concrete apartment block or in a house with a splendid garden. I think the majority would choose the latter. Comment. The regeneration of any country can begin only on the basis of its spiritual rebirth. Certain members of our government, including the president, have realized this and started talking about spirituality. Anastasía is considered by the majority of readers to be a highly spiritual individual, living according to the laws of God the Creator. She speaks of spiritual values, while here you are leading people astray, calling them in particular to get involved in business on their own plots of land, thereby leading them away from spirituality. Response. In the long term, I think that nobody will ever be able to lead mankind away from true values. It's good that our readers today are talking about spirituality. As for Anastasía's sayings, even though I didn't always understand them myself at first, yet later they would still spill over into some kind of concrete reality. Concrete reality is more meaningful to me than any philosophical musings, and so here I am talking about concrete things which I consider most important on the spiritual plane as well. The world probably has a great many concepts of spirituality and God. After talking with Anastasía and trying to make sense out of what had happened, such concepts started coming together for me too. For me, God is a person, a good, smart, and life-affirming person, a person aspiring to a happy existence for people, his children to all alike and to each man in particular. God is the Father, loving and caring for each one of us. Yet to each man he has given complete freedom of choice. God is the wisest person, striving every moment to do only good for his children. And his sun comes up each day. The grass and the flowers grow, trees grow, clouds sail by, and water gurgles, ready at any moment to quench any man's thirst. And I don't believe, and nothing can ever make me believe, that our wise Father could ever think spirituality is something to be attained only by incessant talk about it without specific concrete actions. Ever since the so-called Iron Curtain fell, our country has been flooded with hordes of all sorts of people passing themselves off as religious preachers, and quite a few homegrown ones have popped up as well, all trying to tell us what God the Father wants of us. Some say we need to eat a special way. Others teach us the best words to use in addressing God. Still others, the Christianites, for example, maintain that you have to jump up and down and chant mantras from morning till night. For me, that's all balderdash. I can't imagine no way of painting God more than through antics like that. All that jumping up and down and wailing, any loving parent tries to see it that his son or daughter carries on his Father's work, taking part in conjoint creations with him. God's first-hand creations are all around us. And what can be a higher manifestation of our love for God than a caring attitude to them, or building our lives, our well-being, and that of our children with the help of these divine creations? All these antics and meditations have not made us any happier, either our country as a whole or any of its citizens individually. And the reason they have not made us happier is that they are leading us in exactly the opposite direction, away from truth, away from God. Their efforts have been intense and constant, tossing out all sorts of new variation in their antics as truth. Doctrines come and go. Some of them, which have been around for ages, now only provoke mirth, while others pop up for a few years and then disappear without a trace, like a flash in the pan, leaving only a trail of dirt, garbage, and ruined lives in their wake. To my question as to why we are constantly compelled to listen to various rantings about God from all sorts of preachers, and why God does not speak his own words to us directly, Anastasía replied. Words? The peoples of the earth have so many words with different meanings. There are so many diverse languages and dialects, and yet there is one language for all divine callings. It is woven together out of the rustling of leaves, the songs of the birds, and the roar of the waves. The divine language has fragrance and color. Through this language, God responds to each one's request and gives a prayerful response to prayer. God talks with us every moment, but it is not our spiritual apathy that makes us unwilling to hear him. All I have to do, comes the thought, is chant a mantra or jump up and down, and heavenly manna will fall my way, which will make me happy and choose me as ruler over all. Presto! No sooner said than done. And here we have to spend years setting up our paradise, waiting until our trees grow and bear their fruit and our flowers blossom. Yet if we don't do that, we are not only rejecting God, we are actually insulting him, degrading him with our antics and pompous verbalisms. Of course, you can refuse to listen to Anastasía, and especially to me, but ultimately, at some point, you will walk into a springtime forest or garden, where you will stand still and listen to your heart. Many people's hearts will most certainly hear the Father's voice. As to the question of what God can do in the face of the energies of annihilation holding sway on the earth, to say nothing of so many people taking his name in vain, even as they strive to gain personal power over others, the Father, according to Anastasía, has replied, I shall come up as the dawn at the inception of the oncoming day. By caressing all creations on the earth without exception, the rays of the sun will help my daughters and sons understand that each one in their own soul can hold conversation with my soul. He believed and still believes in us, affirming, there is one main defense against all the many and varied causes leading one into dire straits, against all the barriers that a lie can throw up in one's face, namely the fact that my daughters and sons aspire to the conscious awareness of truth. A lie inevitably has its limits, but truth is limitless. It will impart itself as a conscious awareness to the hearts of my daughters and sons. So there is no excuse for tardiness in retrieving from one's heart the conscious awareness of God's Son, not of a slave or some half-crazed biorobot jumping up and down to the jingling of a bell. But how much can one ask of the Father? Give me, grant me, set me free. Isn't it time we ourselves did something pleasing for our Father? And what could be pleasing or bringing joy to him? In response to a question like this, Anastasía once referred to a simple test we can make use of to verify the authenticity of many religious concepts and tendencies we are faced with. She described it this way. When your heart is stirred by something someone says, claiming to speak in the Father's name, take a look at how the preacher lives his own life, and then imagine what the world would be like if everyone started to live that way. The simplest test can help verify a lot of things. I tried imagining what mankind would be like if everybody to a man started chanting mantras from morning till night the way the Christianites do. And the immediate result was the end of the world. Now imagine how it would be if every man on the earth started growing his own garden. The earth naturally would be transformed into a blossoming garden of paradise. As an entrepreneur, all right, a former entrepreneur, but still one at heart, I like specifics, and perhaps that's why I consider spiritual someone who can take actions which will be beneficial to the earth, his family, his parents, and consequently God. If someone who calls himself spiritual cannot happify either himself or the woman of his heart, or his family or children, then that is a false spirituality. Question. Anastasía spoke of a fundamentally different approach to education for children, and a new school. Is this something feasible only in the kind of community she has designed, or in our major urban centers too? What does Shechinin think about this? Back in your first book, you quoted Anastasía as saying she considers raising children a top priority and was always trying to bring up the subject, whereas you seem to be constantly avoiding it. It almost never comes up in your books. Why? Answer. Mikhail Petrovich Shechinin set up his boarding school in the forest. As soon as the foundation is laid for the first community consisting of families' own domains, we shall have to ask Mikhail Petrovich to work out a special program for the future school. And if he cannot teach it himself, I shall ask him to at least send his best pupils to it and select appropriate instructors from among those currently teaching. I don't think setting up a school is like that in today's urban centers is really feasible. Anastasia's sayings aside, let's just think back to our own school days. You hear one thing at school, another in the street, and still something else at home. While you are trying to figure out where the truth lies, trying to get a complete picture of the world, half of your life goes by. I think we have to try and start living a normal life ourselves before trying to educate our children. And once we've got a life set up that's worthy of human existence, then we can take care of our children in partnership with the school, working in harmony, complementing each other. Anastasía, indeed, often speaks about bringing up children, but she doesn't talk about anything resembling a system scheduled according to days, hours, and minutes. And quite often, what she says is not all that clear. She says, for example, that a child's education begins with your own education, with setting up a happy existence for yourself, with your own attempts to get in touch with God's thoughts. And one of the principal points in this education is precisely the setting up of a splendid kin's domain.